So my name is Miguel Fonseca. This is going to be the technical talk on Gutenberg. Tammy will be across the courtyard talking about design and the editorial aspect of Gutenberg. I work as an engineer. I'm leading the automatic team that's dedicated to developing Gutenberg full-time. And is this not working? Okay. No, not working. Right. So the primary purpose of this talk is to provide starting points for your migration paths to Gutenberg, whatever these may be. Thus, the following outline, there's a lot of ways we could cover this. But first, we'll learn some basics, like understanding how Gutenberg interacts with content. And then we're going to go look at what migration can be and ways to tackle that problem. And then I'll make the case that we should be going beyond just migrating, and there's a whole world of things we can take advantage of in Gutenberg. This talk assumes that you are familiar enough with Gutenberg, the product. You've at least seen the previous introduction. It assumes, obviously, familiarity with the WordPress development environment, practices, etc. And JavaScript, at least rudimentary knowledge of it is needed. It's a bonus if you're OK with ES6, React, etc., but it's not at all necessary. So, understanding the basics of content. First thing we can look at is its shape. This is what we like to call the language of Gutenberg, and it refers to the specification representing content in a way that is structured and semantic and hopefully time-proof. And so, to start with a basic example, I have a blog post about some of René Descartes' writings on learning. And it's a very simple post. It's just got a one-line introduction and then a quote. So before Gutenberg, content is serialized as HTML in post content. And this would be its shape. We have one paragraph with a span and then a block quote. In Gutenberg, nothing really changes in the way that content is persisted. First of all, it's still HTML, and it's still serialized in post content. The main difference is really that now we have the famous or infamous HTML comments that serve as boundaries to our content. So in the first case, paragraph, in the second one, quote. Now, this is a trivial example, and the markings may seem frivolous. A P is obviously a paragraph, a quote is a quote. And basically, the thing with Gutenberg is that blocks can carry much more precise meaning. And an example I like to use is, suppose that I have an online cinema database. And in it, there's films, there's directors, there's the actors that star in them. And it's likely that my website will feature film posters and actor portraits. And ultimately, these will be images. But internally, in my domain, in the domain of my website, these are very fundamentally different objects. And so with HTML comments, or more broadly with blocks, we can enhance document semantics to the granularity that we'd like by simply implementing block types. So I can have a block type which would be actor portrait or portrait, and one which would be a poster for a film. And in the end, the HTML may be exactly the same. It may just be an image tag. But that's fine, because at the level of Gutenberg, this fundamental difference in the meaning of content is understood. In a way, by relying on the HTML contents, by relying on HTML comments instead of tampering with the inside, with the HTML itself, we have the advantage of leaving everything undisturbed. We don't have to adapt our markup to using specific attributes. We don't have to wrap it in divs and such things. Everything is kept the same. But more than that, HTML comments are the only native mechanism that allows us to express something that is available in the source, but then is completely invisible to browsers and any generally standard agent. And so in a sense, we can call what we have with comments meta HTML. It's still HTML, it's just we're using a system that's slightly tangent to just break out of it and be able to describe the very HTML that we're working with. HTML comments can contain attributes, so there's more than just the categorization of what each thing is, each block is. An example for this is the basic paragraph block. This is how each post usually starts. And one option that the paragraph block offers is to use a big initial or a drop cap. And it's just a styling thing. It just makes the initial letter bigger. And the way this is encoded is an attribute drop cap that is simply a Boolean set to true. And this is going to be carried in the opening comment of a block as JSON. This is really the gist of the language of Gutenberg. This, to me, is a pretty interesting subject. In the takeaways sheet, though, there's going to be a lot of references. This is the same layer that's concerned with block parsing, content parsing, serialization, and validation of content. So yeah, if you're interested in this, come talk to me or look at the references. The second part is understanding some of what happens when we're converting content to blocks. The essence is that we look at content, we look at its shape, and we try to match it against the block types that we have available in our editor. We try to convert, and in this process, ideally, we preserve semantics as much as possible. We preserve things like custom classes, so if we're reporting something that's like a paragraph and thus should become a block, a paragraph block, if there's extra class names that we find, we try and port that. Same thing with images. For instance, if we copy an image tag, and if that image in the WordPress edition is using class name align left, for instance, or align right, the transformation is smart enough to look at that and, oh, this is going to be an image block, but more than that, I know some of its attributes. So I know that I'm going to align it to the right. There are some caveats to understand. In core, p tags are added at render, meaning that in post content we can get away with just having text and using line breaks to separate paragraphs. Then at render, we have a filter that goes through that and adds the p tags. Meanwhile, in Gutenberg, we took the decision, we decided that Gutenberg liked its content more well-structured, and so we're skipping that. Auto-p is disabled. That means the blocks are responsible for fully formatting their content. Something to be aware of if you're implementing your own. The other thing is that arbitrary content containers, typically this means divs, will generally be squashed in the conversion process into what we think is the essence of that content. That is, you may take a container and you may flatten it down to the actual things like text, images, anything that's found. If you need to support a particular kind of container for your site, usually you would add a custom block or a custom logic to say, you know what, when you recognize this shape, this sort of div, this is actually this kind of block. So you should be taking care of this and not just reducing it. Right. Some fallbacks to have in mind. I mentioned the classic block before lunch as just a way of encapsulating things that should not be treated as blocks. Internally, it's good to know that anything that isn't demarcated by the opening and closing HTML comments will be visually represented as a classic block. So it's like the non-block block. And then finally, I briefly mentioned the idea of block validation, and we're going to look at that a bit more later. But if we have blocks, Gutenberg blocks, and the source is in any way changed manually into something that Gutenberg can no longer reconcile with what it thinks that block should look like, it will throw a validation error. It will say, this is supposed to be a quote block, but I don't really recognize it as such. And then the user is presented with two options. One is to say, oh, try to fix this for me. And so it will take the knowledge that it's a quote block. It will do as much as it can to convert it back to a normal quote block. And that may erase some of the custom changes to the block. The other option is to say, you know what, I know what I'm doing. I don't want this to be treated as a quote block. Please downgrade this into a generic HTML block. And this is a way of telling Gutenberg, I can manage whatever is in here. And then in the interface, I can switch between editing the source and seeing a preview of what the thing looks like. OK, so this is the main part of the presentation. Migration may mean several things, especially in the domain of Gutenberg. The first item is probably what would be the most obvious. It's taking whatever we have in our sites before Gutenberg and being able to adapt. So we're going to look at that. And the first thing here, this is the first of many APIs that we're going to look at. It's a transformation one, which aims to answer the question of what should happen to pre-Gutenberg content. This is part of the larger block API, and we're going to look at that later. For now, we're going to try and break this down into parts. There's a lot to know about the transformation API. It's a pretty powerful one. We're going to focus only on a couple of aspects. It deals with interpretation of arbitrary HTML. It kind of understands the semantic relationship between block types and versions, and it can even handle other sources of content, including files and shortcodes. We're going to look at a few examples so you can get an idea by induction. The three examples that follow are what we call raw transformations. That means they describe how non-block content should be recognized and converted to blocks. This first one is the raw transformation for the quote block that's a part of the core set of blocks. And the first thing to look at is the property that reads selector, whose value is block quote. The schema property is a more advanced way of determining what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed in a markup of something that is to become a quote. So the first part is pretty straightforward. Essentially, any node that's a block quote should be ideally treated as a quote. And then the schema basically tells us that inside a block quote, the only thing we should expect are p tags. And the p tags themselves, right, so we move from children to then p and children, the p tags themselves should only contain what we call phrasing content. Not just this is part of the HTML spec. It's a bit of an obscure term. It means all the things that you would expect in a P. Emphasis, strong, abbreviation, etc. So we can kind of sanitize instead of just pulling everything that was in the block quote initially. The next example is the one from the very basic paragraph block. This is one of the simplest transforms we could have. We just say we have a selector to look for any P tag, and then we have a schema, again, just to have the sanitization with the phrasing content. But we have this extra parameter priority, and we're giving this transformation the lowest priority possible so that if there's any other block that is looking for specific shapes of Ps, it could deal with that first. In this sense, the paragraph block is kind of the fallback in the transformation process. The last one is kind of abridged, and this is the image block. It's slightly more complex. We're now seeing a different property, isMatch, which is a function, and it's trying to match all the nodes, and it's not just looking at image tags, it's also looking at figure. And the purpose of that is that we would ideally like to recognize figures with captions and transform that into an image with a caption, a native image block. And then the other thing, I mentioned this earlier, within the transform itself, the transform function is a way of saying, with this node that matched the previous function, let me build the final block. That's why we have here return create block core image. Before that, we're looking at the node and testing for some patterns, and one is trying to match any of the classes to the recognizable align left, align right, etc. If we do get a match, then the attributes of the newly created block will be pre-filled with the alignment. Is this? Yes. Before I move forward, again, don't be too worried in trying to understand all of this at once, and in some of these examples, I'm actually just cutting down on some of the code. It doesn't necessarily run, but it's got the things that really matter. All the references will be provided at the end. Okay, the transformation API, aside from just porting content, there's other ways it can benefit the user. And one is the conversion to blocks, right? This was the thing that I didn't show in the introduction talk. This is what the classic block looks like. If I'm editing text, I'm going to see the kitchen sink controls from TinyMCE. And by saying convert to blocks, then these two groups, the text, the paragraph, and then the block quote, will be broken down into the original content that we saw. The other bit is pasting, which is a really nifty thing. Simply by using this transformation API to say how things should be converted, we also get the pasting support for free. This means that if I have my paragraph and then my block quote in the clipboard and I paste it onto the editor, I will get the same result. Right. So moving on to the next stage of migration, this one may be not as obvious, but once we have something with blocks, we should be able to support the evolution of content. There's many reasons for why content should have to change. I'm going to start with an example. Yes, and for that, we're introducing the migration API, which is also a part of the block API. We're going to look at a few examples, and one that I like is the scenario where we need to accommodate evolving standards. So the site tag is part of HTML and has so been since HTML 4.1. In my experience, we haven't really seen it up until more recently with HTML5 and a growing concern for semantic HTML. The site tag is meant to be used if you're quoting someone and you like to give proper attribution. So the core quote block, this is what it looked like initially. It was a block quote. It had as many paragraphs as needed, and then at the end, optionally, the attribution. But the attribution was wrapped in a footer, which was, a solution like any other. But we like to be on the side of valid HTML or semantic HTML. So we'd like to move this and have site instead. However, if we just change the core block by saying that its output should now be using site, any content, any blocks that were created before this change, suddenly if I go back and edit the post, the block will not be recognized because Gutenberg is expecting P, and then site, and we're running it to footer. So this is how the migration API can help us. And you'll have to take my word for it because we haven't seen the rest of the block API. We're going to look at what attributes is, what save is. But the gist of the migration API is that it's a way of saying, this is what my block used to look like. And I can have as many of these descriptions as possible, as needed. That's why the deprecated parameter is an array. So as my block evolves, I can just stack these up. What happens then is that if Gutenberg is trying to parse a post and recognizes a block and it sees it's a quote, and then it's trying to parse the quote and it realizes that the shape that it really has doesn't really add up with what it was expecting because it was expecting a site, then instead of immediately failing, it's going to go through the deprecated declarations, and it's going to try and match any of those by simply using these descriptions of shape. So we're going to look at, in the case of quote, in the save method, and don't worry, we're going to look at what this is. The main difference is that we have the rich text content with a tag named footer, which is the older description of the block. Gutenberg is going to match that, and it's going to go, OK, now I can parse this block. And with this knowledge, it's going to reconstruct the block in its most current form. So it's going to automatically port it to be using site. And the user is not even aware of this. Obviously, if none of the deprecated declarations work, it just fails with a validation error. Finally, in this section, respecting established technologies. This mainly includes shortcodes, metaboxes, CPTs, the big stuff, the scary stuff. I want to start with shortcodes. Their behavior has been preserved. They can be used inline in text. If you use them on their own line as a sort of standalone paragraph, by default, they will be wrapped in the shortcode block, which really does nothing at all. It's just a way of encapsulating neatly because we're obsessive that way. But the neat thing, and going back to the transformation API, we can move forward and we can take, we can use the transformation API to say, if you recognize this shortcode, I actually have a block type. That's the new, best, cool way of dealing with this. And so this is what a transformation for shortcode looks like. Here we're dealing with the gallery shortcode, which is supported by core WordPress. And with this transformation, we're saying, hey, Gutenberg, when you're converting content, if you run into a shortcode that's the gallery shortcode, this is a gallery block. And then the attributes parameter is a way of saying my final block will have these attributes. One of them, actually the only one, is images. And the function there is the way to retrieve the images attribute from the shortcode code. This, in case it's not clear, we also get the pasting support, which is really nifty because if say someone is looking at older documentation or some help site online and it says, if you want a gallery, use this shortcode, and they copy and paste it, if they paste it onto Gutenberg, they won't even see the shortcode materialize. They'll just immediately see the gallery, which is a pretty cool thing, I think. And then metaboxes, there's what I kind of call a best effort for support. It means that they are supported, but metaboxes may fail. Typically, why this happens is the metaboxes depend on the specific environment of the classic editor. And this is something that developers have had to do as a way to cope with the inexistence of dedicated APIs to retrieve information on state, on content, etc. So any metabox that is actively depending on things such as event dispatching on the page or querying the DOM for information, those will naturally fail. If you do have a metabox and you don't have the resource to fix whatever it is that breaks it, you can add a specific flag to your metabox declaration, block editor compatible metabox. And by setting it to false, essentially what happens is that when you open a post, and in this post, this metabox would be displayed, you get the classic editor as a fallback automatically. Post meta and custom post types. These still work the same way as usual. We've seen how custom post type neatly work in tandem with blocks. And I'd like to just mention one thing that I like, which is the post meta is supported as an attribute source. We're going to look at what attribute sources are. But in a gist, it means that instead of retrieving the attribute for a block from the block itself in the content, you can say, no, this particular attribute of my block is to be fetched from this particular meta field of my current post. Since meta and CPTs have been staples of any sort of custom solution when it comes to providing users with dedicated interfaces, you can see how having post-meta support for blocks means that we have much more flexibility in creating transitions into the world of blocks and preserving the information architecture of someone's website. All of their custom fields were stored as meta of a post, and they can move on to be using blocks, and the blocks can even trigger changes in the meta fields, but everything is still the same on the database side. Further, CPTs, there's specific rules that one can add per CPT to say, basically my CPT shouldn't be working at all with Gutenberg right now, so I can just disable it. And there's a filter called Gutenberg can edit post type, I think, for this. Yes, oh, there it is. Okay, so this was the gist of migration, but ideally we're not just coping with change. Gutenberg is hopefully staying here, is here to stay for a while. I like it if we could make the most of it, so instead of just adapting things, there's this whole new world of blocks that we can work with. The most obvious thing would be to be making blocks, but there's other things that we'll consider later. Making blocks doesn't necessarily mean making one from scratch. It depends really on what suits the user's needs the most. And the most obvious thing, but it doesn't mean that it's a lesser solution, is styling core blocks. We have this pretty large set of custom tools. And by simply styling them and the editor itself, and now obviously the front end to match that, we can go a long way. This is because blocks are something that is semantic and is structured the same way throughout our posts and our websites. We know how to target blocks. And this also holds for CSS. All of our blocks follow a class naming schema. So if I wanted to style something like, again, the quote block, I could just say, CSS, look for the class WP block quote, and that's it. There's a precedent in core WordPress before Gutenberg with the editor styles. In my experience, these have never been very adopted. But now, there's a real potential to make the editor experience really, really look like the final output. And again, things like style on queuing still works exactly the same way. The next thing is, I guess, the most exciting. It's actually making custom blocks. And this is where we see the entire block API. The transformations and migrations API were just a part of this. The block API answers the questions of what essentially a block is. And a block at its core is just its persisted shape and its attribute schema. Persisted in the sense that it's the thing that gets saved onto post content, and it's not necessarily the thing that we're seeing while we're editing a post. Yes, a post. Yeah, so both of these data points correspond to the save method and then the attributes object. And then only later, or only at a second stage, is a block described by the ways in which users can interact with it. And so to go along with the save function, there's the edit function, which is a visual description of the block representation, but also everything that goes along with editing that block, that is controls, etc. And then there's secondary things. A block can describe features that it supports. For instance, a block can have specific alignment support. The image and the cover image do this. Instead of just having the normal alignment with no alignment, left alignment, right alignment, I can say with image and cover that I support more than that. And this will give users controls to make the block a bit wider than the normal content, and then a control to make it full width. There's other support types, like I can say this block, the user should not be able to edit it as HTML. They can always revert to code mode, but at least at the block level, they should not be able to edit. Yeah, and finally, all the little things, the obvious ones, a block has a title, can have a description, can have an icon, and can be fit in one of the categories. And the category is usually going to be, determine where in the inserter I can find my block. This can be content blocks, layout blocks, embeds, etc. In the end, this is more or less what a block settings description looks like. We have the bigger objects that we're going to look at, and then all the rest is just primitives, strings describing my block. So these three are the most interesting ones. We're going to look at attributes first. The first three properties that define an attribute are fairly straightforward. They need to have a name, they need to have a type, that is Boolean, integer, object, etc. They have an optional default value, and then they have a source. By default, the source is what we call the block boundary. That is, if you remember the example of the initial for the paragraph block, the attribute was sourced from the HTML comment itself. This is the default behavior. But attributes may be sourced from other places, and one of them is the actual insides of the block. And so for this, we have specific kinds of sources. We have children, which is just a way of saying the actual nodes that are found within my block are to be treated as an array, and this is going to be my XYZ attribute. The other one is even more low level. It's just getting all the inner HTML of a block as a string, and then me as a block author, I'm free to manipulate that. And then there's specific DOM queries. We're going to look at some of those. This is our quote block. Again, the only thing that's changed since the first time we saw it was that it's got this attribute at the top that reads style2. And this is the attribute map for the block, the quote block. The value is just the actual quote. The citation is optional. It's the attribution to a person. And style is basically just a visual choice that we offer by default, where the default style is this one, and style2 has just larger font and doesn't have the border. And so style is obviously a number or anything enumerable, and it defaults to 1. If we don't pick a specific style, because 1 is the default, that's not going to be shown in the HTML comment. The HTML comment only shows the attributes whose value differs from the default. The next attribute is citation, which is optional. And here we can see the source at work. Children was one of the DOM-specific sources. And it's only a matter of selecting for cite. And we get an array. Typically, the array will have 0 or 1 elements. This one is the bigger one. This is the actual quote, the contents of the quote. And it's using the custom queries. So what we're saying here is we should be selecting any paragraph that is a direct descendant of quote. And then inside that, what we care about are the actual nodes of each paragraph. And so at the end, our value attribute, which is an array, should be an array of those nodes. And this is how we then manipulate the content. The default is an empty array because. Moving on to the save function. The save function is a function of block attributes, and it's meant to represent or to output a representation of the block that should be committed into post content. If you've been playing with React or anything like React, this should sound familiar because it's a function of some kind of attributes or props into something sort of like markup. This is, again, the quote block. It's an easy example to follow. Both are the exact same thing. The first one, the one on top, is in ES6. This is how the block is written in core Gutenberg. If you're not familiar with ES6, the example at the bottom is the exact same thing. It's just the transpiling or the manual transpiling. ES6 is just nicer to get a sense of what is what. Just to get a sense, how many people are familiar with ES6 and JSX? Okay, about 2/3. So to break it down just a bit, the save function takes props, and from props it extracts attributes. There are other things that are passed to a block for convenience. And from the attributes, it's going to look at style, value, citation. And its only job is to return that HTML description. So at the top level, we have a block quote. It's got all the style that we want to that we need to inject. And then this is a bit custom since we're dealing with rich text manipulation. Instead of just returning P or cite, we're using this wrapper that's a primitive of Gutenberg. It's part of the rich text library. And it's just a way of having sanitization and escaping of entities, all of that by default. And for the last one, we provide the custom tag name property just to say that it's a site and not a P. Since this is a function, we have all the expressive power of the language we're working with, which in this case is JavaScript. So we could have all sorts of dynamic rendering, logic, all sorts of checks, depending on other sources of data if need be. Moving on to the edit function. It's the save function's big brother, and it's meant to output a visual representation of content, but in the context of editing that content. Again, it's a function of a block's attributes, but it's a function of more than that. It's what we call editing state, which encompasses things like whether the block is selected or not, which of the fields inside a block may be selected or not, etc. With this distinction between save and edit, we come across one of the fundamental decisions, which is the dichotomy between edit and save. Unlike priors in WordPress, like the customizer, where we had one function or one way of showing what our content will look like, it was the same whether we were editing it in place or whether we were changing or saving those those changes, to our site. That said, the fact that we're using two separate functions doesn't require us to be repeating everything. The idea is really to take advantage of components and be able to separate what are just the editing controls from the visual representation of our block. In this sense, a typical edit function will be larger than a save one. The editing interface will expand outside just a saved thing, right? The controls, the sidebar, etc. So this is a different example, just so we don't grow bored of the quote. This is the latest post block, and it's a dynamic block, and it shows the most recent posts that have been published on a given site. And the controls on the site allow you to set specific criteria to filter what posts should be shown. So we see the actual listing, we see the controls on top, and you may notice that even though we only have one render function and specifically one output of the render function, we have multiple render areas in the application. This is achievable because we're using the slot fill API, which is something based on React portals. And the fact that it's using slot fill API is actually abstracted away. It's mostly invisible to authors. And what it allows us to do is to say, when you were building Gutenberg, we build the layout of Gutenberg and we say this is the area where our blocks will be, and this is the place where a sidebar will be. And it could be a document sidebar, or it can be a block-specific sidebar. And in the layout, we say, you know what, this space here, it's actually a slot for a block sidebar. And then in the blocks, we have other kinds of slots. But then when we define a block using the edit method, we're going to use what are called fills. And fills go along with slots that have the same name. So when we're building an edit function, as authors, we're going to call something that's named plugin sidebar. But internally, plugin sidebar will be a fill for that specific slot. This is a pattern that's being used throughout the whole UI, not just for block-specific things. And it's been proving really powerful. And it's been offering a pretty good experience for people who don't have to care about all these details. So this is our edit function. Don't mind the fragment outer block. It's a React thing, if you will. It's just a nicer way of expressing how different pieces of blocks should be glued together. What really matters is that, first of all, we have our little blockwood, which is mostly the same as what we had with the save method. And then, I've collapsed the rich text with the quote and the citation. But then before that, we have this component named block controls, and it contains children. These are toolbar and alignment toolbar. And block controls is one of those Gutenberg primitives that internally is using fill. And this is the actual code for the edit function of quote. And this alone allows Gutenberg to know what it should place as the sidebar, what it should place as the block controls. And I think I'm mentioning this somewhere here. Yeah, no, I'm not. That's fine. Another thing we got for free is that if I'm not currently working on that block, if that block is unselected, the controls will not be seen for it. So I will only get to see the little editing representation of the block, but the sidebar will not be that block sidebar. Otherwise, we'd have all the blocks at the same time rendering their sidebars. And again, the floating block controls also disappear. This is because aside from using the slot fill API, we're tapping into what we call rendering context or block context. And so we know inside block controls can look at whether that block is being rendered or not and skip rendering altogether if the block is not selected. Moving on, we've seen the overall shape of what defines a block. And in essence, to define or to register that block, we use register block type as a function call. This exists both on the client and on the server. But in any case, this is what the final result looks like. If we were to make a hello world block for this event, by now you should recognize all these attributes or these parameters. One thing that's in flux is how much of registration should happen on the client and how much should happen on the server. There's a lot of merit to moving things to the server. We can take advantage of server-side registration. We can have general consistency with WordPress, which is a boon always. We can take advantage of server-side hooks. All of the things that make up the ecosystem of plugins will be at our disposal. Another important benefit we get is that we have render time awareness of blocks. This means that if we're rendering a page for a visitor, by having block registration on the server, the rendering system of WordPress can, if it wants to, look at the post content and immediately recognize what the blocks that make up the post are. And if it recognizes that any of those posts is somehow different, it can do things about it. And so earlier, I showed the latest posts block. That block is by nature dynamic. I mean, if it were static, it would be kind of useless. So every time a page is rendered, the latest posts block should be rendering the most updated version of that set of posts. The way this happens is that the block is registered on the server, and it's got a specific method provided called render callback. And essentially, when the rendering system of WordPress picks up a block that does have a render callback, it's going to run that. And all of the output of the function is going to be used instead of the static version of the block. Finally, again, this is in flux, but the way I see things going is as much as possible we be moved to the server, and only the things that really need to be on the client will be on the client. And this means the edit and save functions. By virtue of being functions, they're tied to the environment they are to be run in, so they need to be JS. But this is fine because conceptually, I think everything aligns pretty well. Because the way I see things going is we're going to have two different terms. One will be registering registering a block type, and this will happen on the server. And then on the client, we're going to be implementing a block type. And by implementing it, we give it the environment-specific things it needs, in this case, edit and save. This is going to be interesting if we want to converge on code bases and have other clients, like a mobile client, for instance. And assuming we have a mobile client that can work with the JS code base or the or the WordPress PHP subsystem, we can have mobile just have the mobile-specific things, and we could have this sort of basically we could have blocks that work on different targets, on different environments. So after this mouthful, another way of extending blocks is instead of making them from scratch, we can intercept existing ones and we can enhance them. So for this, we're using the WordPress way, which means hooks. There's a bunch of them. Again, some live on the server and some live on the client. Having server hooks on the client is something that's fairly new to WordPress. And with the system, there's a number of things you could do. One would be manipulating very basic information, like you can intercept a block and just change its name, the title of the post, the block. But you can go further. Maybe you can intercept, if you remember, the property supports with all the things it's supposed to be supporting. And you could change that. Maybe you have a specific use case for your user, and you don't want them editing the HTML of something. You can just use the filters, change all the block types from core, and say that whatever feature shouldn't be used. You can obviously go further and completely whitelist or blacklist block types, depending on your environment, or even on more granular things like user permissions, etc. Finally, for more advanced cases, you could extend the very edit function, which is just, since it's just outputting elements, you can wrap around and basically create an enhanced version of a block that's just rendering more things around the initial block. Finally, this is the non-code solution. We mentioned this before lunch, but it's good to know that we do have saved blocks. And with saved blocks, we basically the user is left to creating specific blocks by simply adding content and making them reusable things, which is pretty powerful. Another thing is contracts. And we've all been using them if we're working with users and clients in some form of or another. We're going to look at templates and validation. Typically, this is when we have specific scenarios and we want to be sure that users know how to use the tools. We like to lock things. We like to hide away confusing bits of our interface. Is something we've always done. We can do some of this, but hopefully with Gutenberg, my vision is that we can, instead of forbidding and locking things away, we can channel the user into better patterns of usage. In the intro, we saw things like nudging people if they're using low contrast in paragraphs, saying, hey, this is not the best thing. I'm not going to forbid you, but this is, you could do better. We have other examples. What happened here? Oh, right, templates first. Sorry. So templates are specific arrangements like we mentioned earlier. They come with validation, the same way that blocks themselves have validation. If I'm using a custom post type that has a certain template that goes with it, and somehow, even though I had locking for that template, meaning that a user is not supposed to be adding more blocks, maybe the user edited the source elsewhere and added a block. When you go to Gutenberg, it's going to do template validation. It's going to see that the form doesn't conform to what it expected, and it can say, this actually doesn't represent the template, and it's going to offer the option to either fix it, which could mean squashing some of the content, or just leaving it alone. This was the bit that we didn't show before because we weren't doing a tech talk, but register post type, our example with the book, this is the very familiar CPT way of, the WordPress way of adding CPTs. The only thing that changes really is adding this parameter template, and template is just an array with that description of the things we'd like to have. And this is the result. Moving on, I was hinting at validation. I mentioned block shape. There's so many other things we can do. One that comes out of the box is document outline. There's a little button in the interface that gives me a glimpse of all the hierarchy of my document by looking at headings. It's going to go, if there's an H2, an H3, etc., I'm going to see the tree of my document. However, if Gutenberg finds things like an H4 as a direct child of an H2, it's going to give me a nudge saying, the structure of this document is not really accurate. It's not going to try and fix it, but it's going to be nudging me in the right direction. Use once blocks is an interesting case. A block can say, I should be only used once in any given post. There are blocks for which this makes sense. One is the little block that reads read more. So if you have a post, and on the front page of your site, you want to be looking at only the excerpts of the posts, and then you have the little link that says read more. It would make sense to have more than one of these in a post. And so we have this validation. So if you try to have two, first of all, it will be disabled from the inserter, but if you add it in the source, any more block that isn't the first one will be wrapped with a message saying, hey, this is wrong. And you can either delete it, you can transform it into something else. There's ways of going. But the reason why I mentioned this one is that even though it's a part of core Gutenberg, it's implemented entirely with hooks as if it were just a plugin. So in a way, it's kind of a officially sanctioned way of extending or adding business logic to blocks. And it's there in the source. Finally, we have extending the editor. This is where things get really interesting. We can have editor-wide tools. We can have things like plugin-specific sidebars. And this is still in flux, but we will probably have a way of expressing the need for a modal that should take up the entire interface for a temporary action. So the first of the extensibility APIs is the plugin one, and the gist of it is you call register plugin and you pass a specific render function. It's also based on outputting React elements, even though you don't need to know that they're React. And then a very powerful API that goes with it is the data API. This is used throughout Gutenberg itself. It's an abstraction over application state. In the same way that in Gutenberg we have a module named element, which is an abstraction over React. And it's handy just as a facade. It's a way of saying, of giving Gutenberg the possibility of deprecating certain users of React since we're in the middle. We're doing kind of the same with the data API, but we're going a lot farther. And the main reason why is that we're using this in Gutenberg core. We're not using the Redux primitives in most of the code. We're just using the data API. So it's not just something put on the side that we would like block authors to be using. This is the main way of accessing and changing state in Gutenberg. So it's got information on the blocks themselves, on content, and also on application state. It comes with batteries included, meaning we can access all of basically what core Gutenberg itself needs to access. And it's extensible. And it takes care of things such as fetching data, etc. So I like to just show two examples of things that people have been doing with the plugin API, even though it's completely it's in its infancy. I mean, it's stable, but it's fairly new. One is from Dominic Schilling, Ocean 90. He had a public post preview plugin, which was simply a way of generating a URL that you could provide to people who don't have access to your website and see a post draft, even though it's private. And as he himself put it, with just a few lines, he was able to make this interaction with the plugin API using a new sidebar, if the autoplay works. Do I need to press? Hello? Okay. Right, so if you go to the ellipsis menu, now you have plugins public post preview, and it's just a new sidebar, and this is using all the primitives of rendering of Gutenberg, so it's not a custom sidebar, it's the sidebar. The calendar is the one from Gutenberg. All of the controls are. And in the end, we have a much nicer experience where we generate a URL on the fly, we can specify when it should expire, and we can copy and provide that to someone for a review of our post. A deep dive of extensibility is not the object of this talk. This is a big subject, but I will provide the references. I hope that with what I've been saying so far, we can get a sort of like an abstract notions of all the things, of all these different pieces, and that should help you then find the things you need to know. But in case you're wondering, yes, we've been working with this idea that all of the things that Gutenberg core uses should be primitives that are there to be reused. And this is not just UI elements. This is all the ways that data and UI are glued together, etc. So everything is supposed to be very composable, both in core and for extensions. Another example is from my colleague Riyadh. It's a sidebar that's basically a way to access the Unsplash image service. And it just provides a way to search for images and insert them right from the sidebar. And it's super simple. It's just something that you would do in an afternoon. And that's it. Finally, this is again from Riyadh. He's one of the most amazing people. He has a little repo with a lot of different examples that compile and work of ways of extending the interface, adding blocks, adding business rules, etc., called the Gutenberg Extensibility Workshop. I'll give a link for this. And yeah, we're just about to close. And I think in 2016, late 2016, Matt Mullenweg said that we should all be learning JavaScript deeply. And I'd like to say that with Gutenberg, one of the things we've been doing is we're not sticking to frameworks or libraries that then we become hostages of. We're, on one hand, developing the WordPress framework to also be something that does JS and not just PHP. And we're taking what we think are the better developments of practices in terms of data fetching, rendering, etc., kind of putting all of this into a neat modular bundle. And we hope that with these abstractions, we can be pretty resilient as we head into the future. And so to close, this is basically what we looked at. The language of Gutenberg has so far been a proven structure that's been able to accommodate all the things, some of which haven't been foreseen, like nested blocks, things such as blocks that can be not just static or dynamic, but can be both. They can be what we call dynamic. They can be hybrid, meaning that in certain contexts, they can be rendered dynamically, but then in others, when it doesn't make sense, they can be static. So say you have a newsletter, and the newsletter is just sending what you posted in a site, and the site has some dynamic content. Maybe it's the latest posting. It wouldn't make too much sense, or it might, but it's suboptimal to send a snapshot of the links, like the most recent links, just to send that through the email. At the same time, it would also not be useful if you just sent something like a shortcode, which was the way things happened before. Before blocks, you would use shortcodes for something like latest posts. And if you're sending a newsletter, your viewers will probably be seeing a shortcode which has no meaning in the context of email. And not in the context of web, but because we can't render, we see the shortcode. With blocks, since they can be hybrid, we can say, if we're in the context of a newsletter where we don't have the rendering system to convert and have like the dynamic thing, I can send whatever I think is my static fallback. Maybe my static fallback is a URL to the listing of the most recent stuff. And that will always work if I click on the URL. And that way my readers will not have something that goes out of date because it's an email. And then in terms of development, you might like to know that all of the little modules that make up WordPress, that make up Gutenberg and also the packages project, they're available as globals under the wp.prefix. So if you're ever in doubt of what exists, you can just use the console in Gutenberg and you'll have auto-completion. And then we looked at the block API, a pretty big one, and all of the extensibility APIs. This is it for now. One thing that I really wanted to say, I'm super interested in hearing all the questions and all the things you've been doing with Gutenberg if you have. I need to fly back early morning tomorrow. So today is the one day where you can do that. And that said, thanks for your patience for this long, long talk.